The private dining room at Maison Laurier in downtown Ottawa was the kind of place where the napkins were folded into swans and the silence cost extra. Claire Beaumont had worked there for 2 years, and she still hadn't gotten used to the way certain guests looked through her. Not at her, not past her, but through her, the way you look through a window at something more interesting outside. She had learned to keep her expression neutral. She had learned to pour wine without making eye contact. She had learned more than anything that the fastest way to survive a shift was to become exactly what the room expected her to be, invisible. That Tuesday in November, she almost managed it. The reservation had come in under the name Capital, a name that made the Mat D. Gerald straighten his jacket twice when he read it. The group had booked the Cartier room, the most private of the 3 private dining spaces, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the canal, and a table that seated 12 but tonight would hold only 4. Gerald had assigned Claire because she was, as he put it, discreet. What he meant was that she knew when to disappear. She was carrying the first round of water when they arrived. 2 men came in first, the taller one with silver-streaked hair and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a boardroom, was Douglas Whitmore himself. Founder of Whitmore Capital, whose real estate portfolio stretched from Vancouver to Halifax, and whose name appeared in the Financial Post often enough that even Claire recognized it. The man beside him was younger, mid-30s, with a jaw that looked designed for television and a watch that cost more than Claire's mother's medical bills. He was introduced to no one, because he clearly expected everyone to already know who he was. His name, Claire would learn later, was Preston. The woman who came in after them was the reason for all of it. Ji Young Kang walked into the Cartier room the way certain people walk into rooms, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has never needed to announce themselves. She was in her early 60s, slight, dressed in a charcoal blazer that managed to look both understated and expensive in the way only very specific tailoring achieves. She carried nothing except a small leather folder and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who measured everything, including steps. Behind her was a younger woman, her assistant, Claire assumed, who carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of professional attentiveness that reminded Claire of a doctor's receptionist bracing for a difficult patient. Ipo's a difficult patient. Ji Young Kang was, by every available indicator, the most important person in the room. She was also the only one who didn't seem to know any English. Claire noticed it within the first 3 minutes. Whitmore had launched into an introduction, warm, practiced, the kind of corporate friendliness that sounds genuine until you've heard it 4 times, and Ji Young had listened with polite attention and then turned to her assistant and spoken quietly in Korean. The assistant translated. Whitmore nodded. Preston smiled the smile of someone who found the whole process mildly inconvenient. Claire filled the water glasses and stepped back toward the wall. She had studied Korean for 4 years at the University of Ottawa before her mother's diagnosis pulled everything apart. She had been in her 3rd year of linguistics, carrying a minor in East Asian Studies, planning a master's application and a year abroad in Seoul. That was 3 years ago. Now she poured water at Maison Laurier and sent half her paychecks to a long-term care facility in Gatineau, and the other half to a student loan office that had stopped being patient around the same time her mother had stopped being able to walk. She was not supposed to understand what Ji Young Kang said to her assistant. But she did. The dinner moved through its first course, a celery root velouté with smoked trout and a dill oil that Claire had poured onto approximately 200 plates in the past month, and the conversation at the table moved along a parallel track of translation and delay. Whitmore talked. The assistant translated. Ji Young responded. The assistant translated back. Preston watched his phone under the table with the discretion of someone who believed he was being subtle. It was during the second course that Claire began to understand what the meeting was actually about. She was refilling Preston's wine, a 2019 Burgundy that Gerald had personally selected from the cellar, when Ji Young spoke to her assistant in a tone that had shifted. It was quieter, more careful. The assistant's expression changed by a fraction. Ji Young had said, "Ask them again about the clause on page 14. The language is ambiguous, and I want to understand exactly what commercially reasonable means in their interpretation before I go any further." The assistant translated this into English, but not exactly. What she said was, "Ms. Kang would like to discuss the general terms of the partnership timeline." Claire's hand steadied on the wine bottle. She stepped back to the service station and stood very still. She told herself she had misheard. She told herself her Korean was rusty, that she was 3 years out of practice, that she had mistranslated something. She reached for the most charitable explanation she could find and held onto it for about 90 seconds until Ji Young spoke again. "I'm concerned," Ji Young said to her assistant, in Korean that was clear and deliberate and not remotely ambiguous. "The liability clause allows them to reassign the partnership to a subsidiary without our consent. If they exercise that right, we lose the protections entirely. I want to know if they understand that we've identified this, or if they're hoping we haven't." The assistant said in English, "Mrs. Kang is very pleased with the proposal and would like to move toward finalizing the framework this evening." The blood left Claire's face. She understood, with the specific clarity that comes from watching something terrible happen slowly enough to stop it, exactly what was occurring. Ji Young Kang did not have a reliable translator. She had a translator who was either incompetent or something worse, and she was sitting across from 2 men who were feeding her a version of a contract that bore only a passing resemblance to what they were apparently telling her it said. Claire looked at the table. Ji Young was nodding at something Whitmore had said, her expression measured and polite. Whitmore was smiling the smile. Preston had put his phone away, which meant they were getting close to something. There was a leather portfolio on the table near Ji Young's water glass, a contract or the beginning of one. Page 14. Claire thought about her mother. She thought about the call she'd gotten last week from the care coordinator at the facility about a new medication that might help with the progression, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a verdict. She thought about the fact that she had, after 2 years of careful calculation, approximately 0 financial room to lose this job. She thought about Ji Young Kang flying from Seoul to Ottawa to sign something she did not understand. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. She moved to Ji Young's side of the table and reached past her to refill the glass, and as she did, she said, very quietly, in Korean, "I'm sorry to intrude. I work here. I studied Korean at university. I've been listening. I think there may be a problem with what's being translated." The silence that followed was approximately 2 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Ji Young Kang did not move. She did not look up at Claire immediately. She set down her fork with the care of someone who needed a moment to process something unexpected, and then she turned her head and looked at Claire with the kind of attention that Claire had only ever seen directed at rooms, not people. "Say that again," Ji Young said in Korean. Claire said it again. Whitmore had noticed the pause. "Everything all right?" he asked, with the practiced ease of a man who was very rarely not all right. "Of course," Ji Young said, in English, for the first time that evening. "I would like a moment, please, with your server." The sentence landed in the room like a stone in still water. Whitmore's smile held but went slightly rigid at the edges. Preston's hand moved toward his phone and then stopped. "I'm sorry," Whitmore said. "A moment," Ji-young repeated. She was looking at Claire with an expression that was not warm, exactly, but was precise in a way that felt like respect. "If you don't mind." Whitmore minded. This was visible. But he was also a man who understood, at a molecular level, that certain battles are lost the moment you pick them. And so he said, "Of course," and he and Preston excused themselves and stood near the window and pretended to look at the canal. The assistant stood. Ji-young said something to her. In Korean, that was short and not especially friendly. The assistant sat back down. Ji-young looked at Claire. She said, "Everything you heard." Claire told her. She was careful and precise, the way she had learned to be in linguistics seminars, when translation accuracy was being graded. She explained the clause question on page 14. She explained the liability language. She explained the exact words the assistant had translated versus the exact words Ji-young had actually spoken in each instance she could recall, going back to the beginning of dinner. Ji-young listened without interrupting. She opened the leather folder and turned to page 14 and read something that made the muscles along her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "How long have you spoken Korean?" she asked. 4 years of study," Claire said. "I stopped attending university 3 years ago. My mother became ill." Ji-young looked at her for a moment. "I see," she said, and said nothing more about it, but something in her expression acknowledged the weight of that sentence in a way that didn't require elaboration. She turned back to the folder. She read for another minute. Then she closed it. She looked across the room at Whitmore, who was now openly watching them from the window, with an expression that was working very hard to remain neutral. Then she looked at Preston, who had failed to maintain neutrality and looked, instead, like a man beginning a quiet internal calculation about consequences. Ji-young stood. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her English, it turned out, was precisely accented and entirely fluent. "I have a question about page 14. The color that left Whitmore's face in the next 4 seconds was remarkable to witness. It moved like a tide going out. From the temples first, then the cheeks, then the particular gray that comes when a man realizes, very suddenly, that he has been in the room with the wrong assumption the entire evening. "Page 14, he repeated. "The liability clause," Ji-young said pleasantly. "Specifically, the reassignment provision. I'd like you to explain what commercially reasonable means in your interpretation." She paused. "In detail, please." Preston said nothing. He had apparently decided that saying nothing was the wisest available option, and he was not wrong. Whitmore attempted an explanation. It was not a good one. It was the kind of explanation that, the more elaborately it is constructed, the more clearly it reveals what it is trying to conceal. And by the time he had finished, the room understood that page 14 gave Whitmore Capital the ability to transfer the entire partnership to a subsidiary. One, Ji-young had just noticed, that was incorporated in a jurisdiction with significantly less investor protection than the parent company. "I see," Ji-young said, for the second time that evening. She picked up the leather folder and tucked it under her arm. "I will need to have this reviewed by my legal team before we continue in full." She looked at the assistant, who had not moved from her chair and was now looking at the tablecloth with the focused attention of someone who wished they were elsewhere. "We'll also need to discuss your role," Ji-young said to her in Korean at a later time. She turned to Claire. Claire said. "Claire Beaumont, Ems Beaumont." Ji-young regarded her with the same careful, precise attention she had turned on the contract. "You understood what you were risking by speaking," Isn't wasn't a question, but Claire answered it anyway. Yes. And you spoke anyway. Yes. Ji Young nodded once the way certain people nod when they've reached a conclusion that confirms something they already believed about the world. Gerald appeared in the doorway. Someone must have signaled him with the expression of a man who was not sure what had just happened, but was certain it was significant. Whitmore was speaking to him in a low voice. Preston had stepped away from the table and was looking at his phone now without any pretense of subtlety. Ji Young ignored all of it. "I'm based in Toronto 3 weeks out of every 6, she said to Claire, still in Korean, her voice lower now. "I have needed a Korean English interpreter with a linguistics background for longer than I'd like to admit. My current situation has made that clear." A slight pause. "If you're interested, I'd like to have a conversation. Not tonight. Tonight has been enough. But this week." Claire looked at her. She looked at Gerald in the doorway. She looked at the tablecloth and the half-finished burgundy and the celery root soup that had long gone cold. "I'm working Saturday," she said. Something shifted in Ji Young's expression. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "I'll call the restaurant," she said, "and make arrangements." She walked past Gerald toward the exit. Her assistant followed, 2 steps behind, carrying the briefcase and whatever remained of her professional composure. Whitmore watched her go. Then he turned to look at Claire with an expression that was not precisely anger. Anger would have been too direct, and Douglas Whitmore had not built what he'd built by being direct about unpleasant things, but was instead a kind of cold, calculated recalibration. "You'll be hearing from us," he said. That's fine," Claire said. She picked up the water pitcher and went back to the service station. Gerald materialized at her elbow 30 seconds later. He was a man of considerable restraint, Gerald, but his face in that moment was doing a great deal of work. "I'm not entirely certain what happened in there," he said quietly. "There was a translation issue," Claire said. "I helped." Gerald looked at the empty Cartier room, at the contract portfolio that Ji Young had taken, at the half-eaten dinner and the 2 men still standing near the window, not speaking to each other. "Right," he said carefully. Are you all right?" "Yes," Claire said, and then because it was true, and because she was tired of performing otherwise, she said, "I think I might be better than all right, actually." Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Then he straightened his jacket and said, "I'll handle the gentleman," in the tone of voice he reserved for situations requiring maximum diplomacy, and disappeared. Claire stood at the service station and looked out the window at the canal below. The water was dark and moving, catching the light from the buildings along the bank. Somewhere out there, past the canal and the Rideau and the long flat expanse of the Ottawa Valley, there was a care facility in Gatineau where her mother was sleeping, or not sleeping, or watching the small television mounted on the wall, and wondering when Claire would call next. Claire was going to call tomorrow. She called every day, but tomorrow she would have something different to say. She didn't know yet exactly what a conversation with Ji Young Kang might mean. She didn't know what it would pay, or what it would ask of her, or whether it would be the thing that changed not the specific calculus of her life. She had learned, in 3 years of recalculated expectations, not to arrange her hope around things that hadn't happened yet. But she had spoken Korean in a room where speaking Korean had cost her something, and the person who'd asked her to speak it had listened. For now, standing at the service station at Maison Laurier, with a water pitcher in her hand and the Cartier room emptying out behind her, that felt like enough to hold on to. She straightened her apron. She picked up the tray. She went back to work.